I have been dying to do this book review since I read this book. It is that good. Now I'm going to tell you, this book, I found it at the local Goodwill store. And what first caught my mind was the cowboy. I didn't even see in a tux. I just saw a cowboy on the corner here. And then I picked it up off the shelf and look at this guy. He kind of looks like a young Cameron Matheson, kind of, in a way. Doesn't he, from the Hallmark Channel now? He used to be on that, what was the show that I watched? It was a soap opera. Anyway, he kind of looks like that, only with a little bit longer hair to me. Anyway, let me read you the back. Then we're going to hit the paper clips, and then you're going to see why this book is going to get a 40 on my list. I would usually put it in my library, but my library is starting to get overrun by books, so I'll bid it a fond farewell at the end. Yes, I'll say goodbye to the book. Cowboy in a Tux by Marianne Wilson, Delaney's Grooms, American Romance by Harlequin. And the back says, Delaney's Grooms. You don't own a tux shop for 40 years and not know a little something about romance. Carl Delaney. She's still your wife. Not even his rental tux could mask the fact that J.T. Watson was 100% grade A cowboy, nor could he mask the feelings he still had for his ex, now his surprise bridesmaid partner. He hadn't seen Candace Montgomery since their wedding night 8 years ago, after the shortest marriage on record, but now he found a note in his tux telling him that they were still married. How could that be? That woman who stirred his cowboy blood was none other than his own wife. All J.T. had to do was sign one paper, and it would be all over. But why was he suddenly longing to consummate the marriage all over again? So, can you see why my romantic heart is like going, ah? Anyway, I'm going to read you a little teaser before we start in. Maybe that's why the annulment was so easy for you to get. You mean it was easy for you to get, Candace said. Me? What are you talking about? I didn't get any annulment. In fact, I never even got a copy of the paper from you, J.T. said. Candace closed her eyes tightly, lightheadedness coming with a vengeance. What? She whispered. You got the annulment, he stated. She reached for the elevator door, jabbed, and tried to think. No, you said. She tried to remember what both of them had said on that fateful night 8 years ago. No, I agreed to it and said if you wanted to get it, he clarified, his eyes narrowing. Then an old smile touched his lips. Candace wasn't smiling. J.T., she said softly, but couldn't focus on him. He blurred and shimmered before her as the lightheadedness took over for good this time. She grasped at the elevator door frame to the ground herself, but it didn't do any good. She was floating, and the last thought she had before she fainted dead away was that life had just played its cruelest card. She was still married to J.T. Okay, so we're going to skip ahead here to the first paperclip. Like I said, I loved this book. Take a deep seat. It's going to take us a while. Let's put it this way. Dylan's the only Montgomery coming to the wedding. Tension tightened in his shoulders. The reaction came from nowhere, and the point of the announcement is, he asked as he neared the car. She won't be there, J.T. He stopped at the driver's door, and he put his hand on it, the cold metal handle, but it didn't open. What? Her mother's barely through her year of mourning for her father, and Candace is on a cruise somewhere in the Caribbean. I don't even know when she's due back. Thanks for the update, he drawled, jerking the car door handle. Instead, he sank in the car and slipped off his Stetson, tossing it on the passenger seat. What are you, a social commentator on the Montgomerys now? Just letting you know that you don't have a reason for not coming. He exhaled, fighting even the visualizing Candace. He never revisited past mistakes. Never. That wasn't my reason to begin with. Bull, Jack said tersely. Tell it to someone who believes it. You're still mad as hell about what happened, the way that family dismissed you and even controlled her. He didn't know if he was still mad, but he knew that he just thought of the Montgomerys made him wonder how Dylan could have come out of a family like that. Solid, good-hearted, with no airs, the guy was a great friend and the exact opposite of his parents and even Candace. He glanced in the rearview mirror's hazel eyes under heavy brow. Maybe there was still some anger, the only residue of the mistake 8 years ago. No cowboy for their princess, a princess who wouldn't stand up to the king. That's over and done, water under the bridge, J.T. said. Then I guess it won't hurt to tell you she's engaged. The words were like they were meant to nothing to him at first. Candace was engaged. He sat up a bit, gripping the steering wheel with his free hand. Of course, he'd known that Candace would marry sooner or later. In fact, he was surprised that she wasn't already married by now. Some man would see her and want her and love her, and hell, he'd been there, done that. He knew that he couldn't be the only one, even if he was the first. So she's engaged, he asked. Just got engaged. They're headed off to his parents' house, some island in the Caribbean. She found someone suitable, I take it? Very suitable. Mark Forrester of old money. And that's page 10 and 11. We're going to skip ahead. I'm trying to find out where I marked this at. Hold on. Okay. Page 19. A crazy girl running away to marry a man she thought she loved, but a man she never really knew. That was crazy all about. That was what crazy was all about, and it hadn't been forever. She shrugged sharply and forced herself to shut out a past deliberately regulated to a region of forgetfulness. She didn't want to think about it. There was no point. It didn't even feel real anymore. More like a dream that she awakened from to her real life, still in progress. J.T. Watson wasn't a part of that real life. Even when she'd seen the pictures of him and some model in the paper, she found herself looking at a stranger, a man who had no substance for her now. Page 21. Candace had known exactly what her mother had meant, even though she'd been only 18 at the time. J.T. was fine for a friend, but nothing more. And right then he hadn't been anything more, but her mother's opinion had been very unwavering and unquestioned. Even the next year, when J.T. came back to the estate at the college graduation, her mother hadn't changed her opinion. It was Candace who had changed. Moving forward. Page 32. Candace, he said, her name sounding odd on his lips. It's been a very long time. She stood still, a bit surprised, when she found her voice had even sounded almost normal. Yes, it has been. I didn't know you'd be here, he said. That goes both ways. No one told me you were in the wedding party. You didn't figure that since Jack and I were best friends, I just might be here? You weren't here for Dylan, she said, wishing she could turn back from him and walk away. That was so she could stop being aware of the way the woman with him was moving closer to him, pressing against his shoulder, and by that her breathing was too deep to acknowledge any of that. No, she'd make small talk, just be polite, and she'd leave as soon as she could. I was busy with work, he said, but all ignoring the model, started slowly feathering her fingertips up and down his arm, and the silver polish caught in the light. Candace could have sworn that the woman had a ruby stud in the nail of her forefinger. Of course, Candace said, hearing the growing tightness in her voice. I knew you'd understand, he said. She didn't know how long she could stand this meaningless conversation or the way that woman was pawing at J.T. in public. So she decided to break it off with manners, smiling at the woman with him. You have to forgive J.T. He's either dealing with cowboys who don't have a clue about manners, or he's dealing with a businessman who don't care about manners. I'm Candace. The woman kept her hold on J.T. I'm Vonya, she said to Candace, then turned to J.T. and I'm hungry. You have to come up to the terrace with me and keep me from devouring the food. Let's go. J.T. was looking at Candace. She could feel his eyes on her while she watched Voya, and she was almost willed to leave, but whatever she wanted didn't affect J.T. at all. You go right ahead, darling, he said without looking at Voya. I'll be up soon. The dark-haired woman hesitated. Okay, but don't be too long, she said, brushed a kiss across his cheek, leaving a hint of that deep magenta lipstick before she started across the sand. Candace watched her move and then glanced at J.T. A good friend? A friend. You should have gone with her. I will in a few minutes. She might need you to wrestle a celery stick out of her hand before she binges on it. Incredibly, that made his smile expression, and this is page 34. She'd entirely forgotten. She wished that she hadn't seen that. Again, not the way his eyes crinkled or the way that showed suggestion or that single dimple on that one cheek. Whoa, who would have thought that a Montgomery could be catty? A suffocating sensation was making it difficult for her to breathe. Who would have thought that you'd be with, she bit her lip, that sort of woman? That sort of woman, he asked, with a smile thankfully dying with each word. She seemed high maintenance, she said, her words coming out of her mouth that she hadn't consciously thought about before uttering, I know how much you hate complications and demands. You're right, I'm not good at any of that, he said, with his hazel eyes were intent on her. I like things simple and direct, and Vanya, despite appearances, is very simple and direct. Sure, and a dog lays eggs. He stared at her, then suddenly laughed, really laughed, an explosion of humor that rocked her. Darling, where on earth did that come from? She didn't have a clue, not more than anything. She stood there while she was standing there verbally sparring with J.T. If there's nothing else, she murmured, but he didn't move. Nice dress, he murmured back. Unexpectedly, he reached out, brushing the tip of his forefinger along her bare arm. The slight roughness belied his status as a CEO in the international company. She knew if he looked at his hands where they were calloused were from working on the ranch, calluses that she remembered way from long ago. She trembled, jerking back from that contact. Okay. Trying to see where we're going to start again. I'm no expert on manners, J.C. said, looking at Candace, but I think an introduction is needed. J.T. Watson. Oh, here we go. This is kind of comical. Mark Forrester, she said somewhat reluctantly. Oh, yes, of course. J.T. put his hand out to the other man. I should have known. Have we met? Mark asked as he shook his hand with J.T., then drew it back to hold Candace a bit more tightly. This is page 36. No, but I've heard all about you. He glanced at Candace. His eyes were unreadable. Jack says you're engaged. He glanced at her hand. But I didn't see a ring. Mark patted his breast pocket. I've got it right here, he said. J.T. glanced at Mark. A new tradition? The soon-to-be groom carries the ring around with him? Mark laughed at that. No, just a sizing problem, but it's fixed. So when's the big day? Mark held on to her hand a little bit more tighter now, holding close to her. The sooner the better, but Candace wants to wait a while, probably next spring. J.T. lifted an eyebrow in that direction. Oh, you're not rushing into anything. She held her own. Mark's kept his hand on her waist tight as well. She hated the sarcasm, even with it veiled by an inconvenient comment. No, I'm not. That never works out. You can get yourself in a real mess by rushing. J.T. shrugged. There's always divorce. Or an annulment, he said so casually that it shook her. Then Mark was speaking, and his words were only added to her discomfort. No, we're doing this right, and only once, period. He pressed his lips to her forehead. Isn't that right, Candace? Yes, right, she whispered. She never told anyone but Whitney about the fiasco with J.T. She never intended to, that the annulment had washed it all away, but now she knew that if she told one other person it had to be Mark. She could feel a sense of pressure building that had never existed until this moment. Mark's hold on her eased a bit. Are you the same J.T. Watson who's working with Vortox? That's me. No wonder that name sounded so familiar. And then they'd talk again, kind of exchange pleasantries. And they talk about her dress. And then she makes comparisons between Mark and JT. Why not get married in a few days or a few months? How about Labor Day weekend? Enough time for our parents to drive right up here. which he's pressuring her. And she kind of gives in, and then Mark let her go, and then she realized what he was doing. He reached for his pocket and pulled out that engagement ring. He lifted her hand and slipped the ring on her finger and whispered, "I do." She must love him, surely like him, and he was touching her while he was doing it. He was almost comforting, not making her crazy. She almost laughed at that, but not before she had a glimpse of J.T. at the water's edge, staring at her and Mark. Damn that J.T. and damn herself for letting him get to her. She wasn't the only one that make him make her crazy. Not now. She wasn't going to let him have that effect when she was with Mark. She could put him out of her life for good, and she knew how to do it. The sooner the better. When J.T. was gone, she managed an unsteady smile. Yes, Labor Day, I'll marry you then. It's kind of like she's just with Mark to make J.T. jealous, but yet she's also with him to make business better for her family. So, a debutante, if you will. Let's see here. As J.T. turned from the sight of Mark slipping the ring onto Candace's finger, this is page 39, he thought about the ring he'd given her. He didn't even know where it had gone. There was a memory of her taking it off, and that was it. A simple gold band that he bought at the jeweler's near the chapel, $100. Not a great loss, he concluded, no matter what happened to it. He almost ran into Jack, but barely stopped before the impact. The groom was wet, and the tuxedo nearly ruined. "Hey, take it easy. You almost ran me down. Sorry. I wasn't looking. What's wrong?" "What are you talking about? You're married, and from what I can tell, to a pretty wonderful woman." "Oh, yeah, I'm perfect. Yes, wet, but perfect. I was talking about you. You look like you lost your best friend." "I'm just married, not dead," he said, gripping J.T. by one shoulder. "Cheer up. I intend to." And he takes his drink of champagne, drinks it quickly, and, "Is it that bad?" "No, it's nothing. I hate to see something." J.T. Motioned vaguely behind him to the couple on the sand. "How in the hell that happened? You said I wouldn't have to put up with the Montgomerys." Jack looked past J.T. "I saw you talking, but I didn't know that she got to you like that." "I'm just asking a question, and no, she didn't get to me," he said, just wondering how he could lie so easily. And that was page 41. So as you can see, these two are denying their passion. They're denying their need for each other. And will they overcome it? We'll just have to wait and see. Now we're going to replay what happened all those years ago. Page 46. The chapel by the hotel had been determinedly romantic, with the cupids everywhere, pink and red dominating the color scheme, and artificial colors, a short aisle that ended in a white podium draped with roses. The bride had been in jeans with a cropped pink sweater, and her blonde hair caught in the high ponytail. The bride had carried daisies he'd brought by the door, and he hadn't been able to tell if she wore any makeup or not, but she'd been achingly lovely. Her blue eyes shadowed by those improbable long lashes, her pale lips softly parted as Candace had looked up at him. He cleared his throat. "Brides are all supposed to be lovely," he said. Carl glanced back at him. "Yeah, that seems to be a tradition. So many of the ones I have watched grown up to get married." Page 47. J.T. couldn't remember Carl quite clearly from a past to present, or yet the middle of things, on the fringe, sort of the way he'd been, the man that he's always been there watching. "You said you wanted to talk to me about something," he said, not wanting to talk about the brides any more. "Did I? Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me, I must be getting old." The man was probably in his late 50s, early 60s, not exactly ancient. "Everyone forgets now and then," J.T. said automatically. "Thank you for trying to make me feel better," Carl said. "Oh, I remember. You dropped this earlier when I was returning it." It looked vaguely familiar, remembering something about a piece of paper at some point in the evening. This didn't look familiar, though. Ivory neatly folded into a 2x2 square. Carl's blue eyes touched by J.T.'s look, remembering from the past. The man had a way of looking at you if he knew something no one else did but J.T. Had never been able to figure it out. And that was something. He still couldn't. "I dropped this?" "Yes, earlier." He opened up the paper in the dim light, could barely read out what the couple of lines written in the precise script. "When there is love, you are married forever." This isn't mine, J.T. was quick to reply on page 48. Held out the note for the other man. Well, it's not mine, Carl shrugged, but he didn't take the paper bag. Keep it. Things usually end up where they belong. J.T. blinked. What? Do what you will with it. He'd throw the note away, he thought, but just nodded and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he remembered the paper, feeling it in his pocket during the ceremony. He could have slipped it out without even recognizing that he'd been so distracted by Candace. Maybe that man had worn out this tux before here. He looked around. If you'll excuse me, J.T., sir, you wear my work well. You sound surprised. One is always surprised when a rough diamond becomes a polished brilliant. A rough diamond? I'm sorry if I offended you, Carl said quickly. I forgot my place from time to time. His place? The man had always been a tailor to kings and world's leaders. He spoke of his place, so that sounded badly with J.T., maybe because he'd been made to feel like that was his place a time or two, at the hands of Candace's father, John Montgomery. As a matter of fact, sir, you don't offend me. Believe me, I'm a Texas cowboy who happens to be good at business. A rough diamond is, as you say, no apologies. Yes, no apologies, Carl echoed. Laughter cut into the conversation, and Candace shimmered in the light. J.T. stared hard at Carl. There is one rough diamond who is getting hungry. Ah, yes. They say that they have a veritable feast up there on page 49. J.T. could feel Candace was getting closer. Candace and Mark was hand in hand. They'd go to say hello to Carl, but he wasn't sure at all what they were talking about. He knew they should walk away, but he watched Candace's eyes shadowing in the evening. How she glanced in their direction and suddenly lurched in the region of her stomach was very real. Excuse me, he said. I was just saying that tonight that seems to be very special, J.T., a night for surprises. J.T. didn't miss the way Candace's expressions tightened on her face, and the hands moved to grip Mark's arm. Are there any more surprises? She asked. Oh, yes, more surprises, Carl said. J.T. waved a hovering waiter away that had more champagne, and Candace had a hold of Mark's arm. He had been in that world once for a very single heartbeat, a very long time ago. He could almost hate Mark for being there now. That's page 50. Moving forward, page 64. The first dance is man and wife, someone announced, and she saw Jack and Sandy walk into the ballroom and go to the center of the floor as the others rimmed the outside. Candace stayed where she was, watching the two of them, the way they held each other and smiled at each other. Then Jack kissed Sandy and her heart lurched. They loved each other. Simple. They really loved each other. Something others seemed to find so easy she'd never even stumbled upon. That thought shocked her. What was she thinking? Was she in love with Mark? Of course she was. She liked him. He was a good man. And he was bright, very handsome, everything she could want in a man. That had to be love, didn't it? That kind that lasted forever? Love wasn't madness and heady craziness. Love wasn't forgetting everything just to have one touch. She drank the cool champagne, letting it spread in her middle. Love wasn't craziness. That was desperate need for someone else. This was all J.T.'s fault. All his fault. That man drove people crazy. He drove her crazy. After 8 years of no contact, not even calling her, coming back to the Montgomery Beach to see Dylan, he just drove her crazy. She finished the champagne, then turned to get another, and almost dropped her glass when J.T. was right there on page 65. He was so close. She could see the way the gold flared in his irises. She knew if he inhaled, the essence of that man would fill her, and that was the last thing she wanted. And she certainly didn't want to lean even closer and say, for her ears only, "Can we talk?" Candace stared at J.T. He wanted to talk. "We didn't do much talking before," he said in a very low voice, only she could hear it, and know the purpose of his words brought heat to her in her very unwelcome areas. This was no way to hide from the memories of them not talking 8 years ago. "There's nothing to say," she said, hoping that this would stop whatever was happening in its tracks, but she wasn't that lucky. J.T. came even closer, and she hated the way she could see the faint lines etched at the corners of his mouth, and remember the way his lips felt when they touched her skin. "There's lots to say," he persisted and motioned towards the interior of the hotel. "Can't we find a quiet place to finish this?" Finish it? She looked into his hazel eyes. What he could do to her with one look, even be finished? Why aren't you roping cattle on the ranch of yours instead of coming here? I came for Jack's wedding. Why? Why not? You didn't come for Dylan's wedding. She'd been prepared for that, seeing J.T. then, and then she had been overwhelmingly relieved when he backed out. But she wasn't prepared now. He's your friend, too. Okay. I've got to start marking these better, kids. I'm telling you the truth. Okay. So this is another conversation between Carl, the one who made the tux, and JT, the one that she's, yes, still married to. Okay. Now the thing is, if you're at the head of the table, I have to sit somewhere, and since I don't know too many people here, I'm not sure where to sit. I can help you there, Carl said. He bowed slightly to Vonya. I am Carl Delaney, and I have a table that is much too big for me. Would you like to do the honor of being my dinner companion? Oh, that's lovely. Yes, thank you. She looked over at J.T. Isn't that sweet? Very, he said. Carl slipped her hand in the crook of his arm. Lead the way, Mr. Delaney, she said, and I heard that you have made clothes for so many famous people, she grinned at him. I bet you know all the dirt on some pretty big names. Part of my business is being very discreet, but sort of like a psychiatrist or an attorney. Oh, sure, she said, walking away with him, but you can trust me. J.T. watched them go. Carl made a match for her. He glanced around and spotted Sandy and Jack being seated at the head of the table, same where they'd taken pictures earlier. Steffi was there, monitoring toward him to come over to the table. He headed across to the terrace, very aware that Candace wasn't amongst the group, although there was an empty chair between Steffi and Sandy's chair. He slipped into the chair and glanced at Jack beside him. He was busy kissing Sandy, a kiss that seemed to last forever. Then Jack sat back and saw J.T. Marriage, he said, grinning in her ear. Nothing like it. I never would have pegged you for such a bad case of love sickness, he mumbled, putting his champagne on the glass on the table. If this is being sick, never an invent a cure, he said with a grin. Too bad you aren't infected. I've got my own diversions. I said love sickness, not lust sickness, J.T. I've given up on anything that complicated, he said, fingering his champagne glass. Never say never. Never give up. Page 73. We move forward. Big jump. Some of you are like, thank God. Okay. Okay, so JT's watching Vanya across the ballroom, wondering how beautiful she is and how aware he is of her, yada, yada, yada. Then Candace is there, stepping into the room. He felt for the delicate blonde woman, his wife of 8 years. She changed into a simple dress, certainly not the one that she had on before. And let's see. Then things happened quickly. Percy rushing past him, Candace looking over at him. Mark was there, but the man was too close to, and J.T. turned away from seeing them lean towards each other. Candace was in the wedding party. How could he hate a man he didn't even really know? How could he still want a woman who wanted another man? Everything about Candace in his life had defied logic and reason, especially his reaction to her. So you've forgone the tuxedo for more comfortable clothes. J.T. turned to Carl. The gray-haired man was studying him. Do you want the truth, or do you want me to spare your feelings? I believe the truth is always the best route. This is page 127. The other was 126 and 125. Although one is not always able to practice in its purest sense. J.T. smiled at the man. He didn't know Carl very well, but some basic level he felt a connection with him. That hadn't happened to J.T. too often in his life, but for some reason it was happening now, with a man who was old enough to be his father. I had an unfortunate experience with the ocean, and I really didn't want to wear the tuxedo the way it looked. It would have done a disservice to you and your artistry. J.T. admired the man, increased with Carl's, didn't appear shocked or outraged. He smiled instead. Well, my boy, it's yours to swim in if that's what you wish to do. There was no prima donna, no artist. Let me assure you that the jacket is just fine. It survived, but the pants won't be seeing the light of day again. Is that why you look so deep in thought when everyone else is having a glorious time, or were you pondering the fate of the tuxedo? He waved his hand dismissively. You have my permission to throw it out with a clear conscience. Thanks for that, but I was trying to figure out what to do with something else in my life. A problem? I don't know, he said, but he realized what a lie that invasion was. A surprise complication. From what I have been told, you solve major problems before breakfast. This one must be of a great importance to you. He could hardly admit about how important it was to figure out what was going on with him and Candace. It's bothersome for sure. Oh, I see. You see what? That this sounds like woman trouble. J.T. felt a distinct feeling again that this man could read minds. I need to go outside and get some fresh air. I just happen to have two of the best cigars known to mankind in my pocket. Would you do me the honor of sharing one with me? The old worldly air man offered the cigar, and they share it. Let's see. It's a lovely night in every way. This is page 129. And Carl and JT are talking again. And let's see. He rolled the cigar in his fingers, one of life's small pleasures. Then he looked at JT through the drifting smoke. I have been where you are. Excuse me? Woman trouble. It's a universal condition when one decides to take the chance by falling in love. Love? JT thought about that. He wasn't sure he even knew what love was, much less if he ever experienced it. But whatever had happened with Candace had come close. He knew that now. You don't have to be in love to have trouble, he murmured. You think not? Were you in love? Were you? He retorted, softly, a question meeting a question. JT took another pull on the cigar. I don't know. How about you? I was never married, so one has to wonder if it was love or not. With real love, there could only be marriage, but a marriage that would be forever. With love, whatever happens is forever, Carl said. JT looked at the man. You read that note, didn't you? Note? The piece of paper you said fell out of my pocket, the one you gave me back. He finally said, fingering the cigar. What did it say? When there is love, you're married forever, JT repeated. And what? Carl took his time drawing on the cigar and exhaling before he answered the question. Do you agree? I don't know. And what are you going to do about it? Do about it? What is there to do about it? One would think that it's obvious that you're going to find out that yourself if that's true. And that's page 130. Page 131. What was going on? I don't know what you're talking about. First, one must be married, then one must figure out if the marriage was forged from love or if it was from, he shrugged, something else. Like what? The glow at JT's face was almost humorous. Lust, need, convenience, parental pressure, the list is endless. His humorous tone faltered, almost as endless as one's reason for not marrying. JT didn't know where this was going, but he sure wasn't going to wait around to find out. You never said what your problem with a woman was all about. Neither did you, sir, Carl said. Let's just say that there are things that I should have done that I can never do now, and the time is past. He touched JT's shoulder. Don't live with regrets. Find out what is real and what is not. Then you can go on with your life before it's too late. For a man who didn't suffer confusion easily, JT felt totally confused. He couldn't figure out what was going on, either with himself or Candace or this man. But one thing he knew. Candace was marrying Mark. She couldn't wait until they were married. Sometimes we just have to walk away and let things go, he said. No regrets, just leave? What do you do? The man took his time drawing on the cigar, then the smoke drifted up, haloing his head, as he said the words that were oddly tight. Nothing, but do not use me as a role model. I have made many, many mistakes. I trust that you will do better than I did. This is page 132. JT could hear an edge of sadness in that man's voice. Wondered what happened to put it there. But before he could say anything, Carl motioned for the hotel. It's time to go back. Then again, can one never, ever go back? JT stared at the glow of the lights spilling out in the night. He heard the mingling of the music and the laughter in the air. Could he go back? Would he want to if he could? He hadn't even thought of that. He just thought of getting the annulment, finalizing it, and going on to find sanity away from here, to get on with his life. But now several questions nudged at him. What if he didn't? What if there was any sanity out there? What if he walked away and Carl was right, he'd regret it for the rest of his life? One small piece of advice, if you will, Carl said, cutting his thoughts back to JT. Could I stop you? He asked dryly. Indulge me. Go ahead. Remember, it is so human to walk away, to give up, if things get too complicated or too hard to deal with, or if one gets too hurt or angry. Very human. But the cost can be staggering. JT stopped and looked directly at Carl. What is this conversation all about? Just a conversation over a cigar, Carl said, and I thank you for it. Carl is like the guardian angel in this story, and you'll see why at the end. But his words speak volumes. How you can walk away because you're hurt, you're scared, and that's all human. But the regret you live with forever. That's the worst part of all. Okay. Okay, so Candace is upset at how fast JT is working with his lawyers to get this annulment pushed through, even though she's wanting the annulment to get pushed through so she can be with Mark and he can be with Voya, but yet she doesn't know that Voya is just there because he needed a hot date to go to the wedding. And Mark, well, she's not really in love with Mark because she's still in love with JT, but she's trying to avoid her feelings. So they had taken this elevator ride and things went awry in that elevator ride. And she leaves the elevator. The phone rang and he rolled to the left and he got out of bed. Oh, wait a minute, no. That's the wrong part. Okay, so yeah. This is kind of where I was going with that. They had a thing out on the beach. His tuxedo got wet, so they had to change clothes. Then after the change of clothes, let me see, this is where they're riding the elevator. Yes, right here. Okay. Mr. Watson, Carl Delaney said. Yes, what's wrong? He asked. That's what I was going to ask you. I don't, sir, I just saw Candace off in a cab. She wasn't with Mark. That surprised him and pleased him in some way. Thanks for the report, but what does that have to do with me? She was upset, at least she seems to be. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she was fine, but she needed to get home. It seems she has this appointment early in the morning with you. He didn't understand any more than he understood why she would tell anyone, least of Carl Delaney. This is page 180. Page 181. The line was quiet for a moment. Then Carl said, after our talk, then finding Candace upset seeing her, he hesitated. I knew years ago that there was something between the two of you. Now it appears, at least to me, there still is. Where are you going with this? Simply put, I will not tolerate Candace being deliberately hurt in any way. Of course, he said. You understand what I'm saying to you? No, he really didn't, but not really. Carl had not even said it. I wouldn't hurt Candace deliberately, I promise you that. The man exhaled softly over the line. And you are a man of your word. A statement, not a question. Yes, sir, I am. Good, then do whatever you must, he said cryptically. I trust that you will do the right thing. And then he hung up. See what I mean? Carl is like the guardian angel. He's like the one that roots him on. It's always nice to have people that are looking out for your best interest and want you to be happy and in love rather than tear your world apart. Okay. Page 232, The Misunderstanding. Now they've gotten back together, and JT has went out of the room, the motel room that they were in, and he overhears a phone conversation, and he misunderstands it. It's horrible. We're going to do it now. Whitney, you're back. Candace, where are you? I called your house, your mother, and they all left a message about being gone for a while. What's going on? Candace didn't know where to start, but once she told Whitney about being at JT being at the wedding, the rest of the story just spilled out. Whitney was silent during the telling until Candace got to the point where she told JT she was still married. What? You and JT are still married? Very. The annulment never went through. Candace, that's... She paused. What is it? You tell me. Candace took a breath and then said the truth. It's a blessing in disguise. Why? Whitney, you know how it was, how crazy I was about JT. Well, it never stopped. It was sort of hibernating or something. It was still there. You and JT? She talked quietly, telling her about the trip and telling how it ended. When she finished, Whitney was silent for a long moment, then asked, You still love him? Absolutely strange, isn't it? This is page 232. Not strange as you loving JT and being engaged to Mark. What about him? I feel so horrible about all that. I mean, I never should have let it go that far as it did with him. I was so stupid, and it's horrible for both of us. I don't know how to tell him it was all a huge mistake. Her voice was shaking now. It's going to hurt him, I know. I just need to figure out how to let him down gently, and I hope that he understands. Candace, what about your mother? You and Dylan, you both have told me how she feels about JT. Has this changed? No, nothing's changed. Nothing. She's excited about you and Mark. How's she going to adjust to you and JT? Candace fell back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. I don't know. I don't know about anything anymore except that I want this marriage, and I want it so badly that it's scary. You love him that much? More than I can say, she said. Then I'm behind you for what it's worth. It's worth a lot. She closed her eyes. You know something? I think your Uncle Carl likes JT. They really got along well at the wedding. Uncle Carl's smart about people. Smarter than I've been, she said with a sigh. There was a sound outside, then the door opened and JT was there. JT was dressed in jeans, boots, and a shirt with a Stetson pulled low, but not low enough to hide his expression. He looked distant, almost cold, and it shocked her. I have to go, she said into the phone. I'll see you when I get back. You better see me and fill me in on everything. Sure, she said, and never looked away from JT as she hung up the phone and stood. Where were you? She asked. Page 233. JT stayed by the door. Suddenly she felt awkward and uneasy, arranging for the car to be towed and signing for a rental car. He tossed a set of keys onto the bed. It's all yours. She didn't understand. What? The rental car, it's all yours. Go back home and I'll make sure the annulment is done in a week. You got my word on it. She could barely take in what he was saying. The annulment? You bet. Then it's over. He cuts the air with one hand. Forget it. It was a mistake. She knew there was nothing that she could say. The tremendous pain was numb. Nothing was happening, but she was watching JT tell her that everything was a mistake, and they'd get the annulment, and she wasn't feeling anything. That was wrong. Very wrong, but she didn't know what to do. I'm making this easy for both of us. It was a mistake, and it's done. I'm leaving you the car. I called Taylor, and he says he can do an annulment in a week. You get the papers. She stared at him, and the man who had loved her and heard him say it was nothing. The pain was monumental, but it wasn't even there. There was a humming sound, strange somewhere, monotone in her ears, and even though JT was still talking, she couldn't understand a thing he was saying. She sank into the bed, waited until he quit talking, and looked up at him. Are you through? He stared at her hard and then nodded. Yes, I'm through. Then leave, she said. His mouth thinned into a hesitant line, and he hesitated, his hand on the doorknob. A Montgomery to the end, he said. Leave, she repeated. The rental car's outside. I'm writing the tow truck driver. They'll have your car, the BMW dealer in Sacramento. She stared at him. No, don't leave, she said. Stay right there. She stood, letting the sheet drop as she reached for her clothes. She dressed in front of him, not caring what he saw or what she felt. She dressed, turned to grab the purse without bothering to comb her hair or put her makeup on. I'm leaving. She grabbed the keys off the bed. I'm the one walking out. You stay here and do whatever the hell you want to do. I just don't care. She said as she walked out the door. She took a few feet from JT, then said one last thing that she knew would hurt. My mother and father were actually right. This was a huge mistake. She saw his expression tighten with a brief flash of satisfaction, and making him hurt a bit was gone. When he nodded, damn straight. She ducked past him, grabbed the door, jerking it open. Without looking back, she left and closed the door without slamming it, and walked onto the gravel. A blue Chevy was parked a few feet away, and she crossed to it. She got in it and headed back home. She stared straight ahead, wondering how a dream could have turned into a nightmare in such a short time. Page 236. JT had come back to Montgomery Beach 24 hours later, brought the nightmare with him. He let her think it could all be a dream, and then he turned it right back into a nightmare, and then he let left her with nothing. She turned and to pull over to the side of the road. She parked, and when everything fell out, she hugged her arms around herself. The pain rushed through her, overtaking her, and tears came in great gulping sobs. If she was going to die, she knew she wasn't going to, but she'd live and learn how to exist with a part of her soul gone forever. Now you're going to hear how JT heard what he heard, but it wasn't meant that way, and he took it the totally wrong way. It's so funny how a simple misunderstanding and foolish pride can tear two people that are supposed to be together apart. JT walked away from the cottage 10 minutes later with Candace, words echoing deep inside him. I feel so horrible about all that. I mean, I never should have let it go that far as it did with him. I was so stupid, and I feel so horrible for both of us. He just got into the door of the cottage right then and heard her talking. He stopped dead in his tracks by what he heard. I don't know how to tell him. It was all a huge mistake. It's going to hurt him. I know that. Hurt him? It was killing him. He kept walking towards the tow truck. She was miserable about what happened. Just the fact she'd been 8 years ago. But this time she had Mark. I just need to figure out how to let him down gently and hope he'll understand. He forced this. If he hadn't, they wouldn't be here. They wouldn't have been together. He'd done it again. He wanted her, he'd taken her, and she regretted it. Page 237. No, nothing's changed. Nothing. Nothing had changed. Certainly not because he loved her. Nothing. He nodded to the tow truck driver, then climbed into the cab and closed the door. I want this marriage, and I want it so badly. It's so scary. She wanted her marriage to Mark, damn it all. He should have been noble. He should have sent her back to Mark with his blessings as long as she was happy. He'd be happy. That almost made him laugh. What a joke. He hated the thought of her being with Mark, and he hated the thought of never having her again. Noble? Not even close. And it was a joke that he promised Carl Delaney not to hurt her on purpose. The man said nothing about her hurting him. And God, it hurt him. Giving up her like hell. But he made a great deal. If he couldn't make it work, he'd let her go. And he was letting her go. Candace comes back. And she finds out that Carl and her mother have been together. Had this world gone crazy? Her mother and Carl? Carl stood quietly while she felt as if the world had fallen down into a rabbit hole and she'd come face to face with the Queen of Hearts and the Mad Hatter. But this wasn't a fairy tale. This is page 238. Mother, she whispered. Grace stood quickly and crossed to Candace. Oh, dear, I didn't hear you come in. How long have you been there? She panic-stricken Grace Montgomery out of control. Another first. I can explain. Carl touched Grace's shoulder. No, it is I who should explain. I am the stranger in this house. Grace turned to him in a tiny, delicate, in front of the tall man. Carl, no, that's not true. You belong here. He smiled down at her, an indulgent smile. Oh, Grace, you make me so happy. I'm leaving, Candace said. This couldn't be happening. No, both of them said at the same time. Mother, you and Carl, you two. Grace crossed to where Candace stood by the door. Darling, this is my fault. Carl wanted to tell you, but She shook her head. He's been so impatient, but I just couldn't. Mother, are you saying you and Carl are having an affair? Grace colored at that question. Candace, I know what you are thinking. You must think, but... Mother, I don't know what to think, she said, honestly trying to deal with the strangest feeling of free-falling and having no idea how to get it to stop. Page 239. Darling, I can explain, and I want you to understand. You have to understand. She shook her head. This is so difficult. I just don't want to hurt anyone, especially you. Carl had been silent only a few moments, but spoke up. Grace, it is I who should do this, he repeated. I must explain to Candace. Candace looked from Carl to her mother and knew that there was no explanations needed. She had caught Carl and her mother on the morning after, and her mother looked like a woman in love. Tears were there, but not because of the hurt, but because the two of them had obviously found what she knew she would never have. Everything made sense to her now, or at least her mother's actions at the wedding yesterday. Carl had been there every time she turned around. Carl was talking to her mother, being close but never touching until now. She shook her head, turning them across to the counter to get coffee. She needed coffee to help find some sense in her life. She poured a cup of coffee and finally turned only toward Carl. Carl, let me make this easy for both of us. She spoke a truth and she'd known all her life, yet quiet face. I know my mother and my father didn't love each other, not really, or maybe at first, but after that, they were just together, and if you're making my mother happy, it's okay. Another truth came out of its own violation. She'd never been happy until now. He came closer, a slight smile on his lip, but concern there. How do you know what your mother and father felt for each other? I just know. She sipped her coffee. No judgments, no thoughts, that this will not be, you would put it, proper, that a mere tailor is not fit for a Montgomery, a common man? She was almost able to hear her father saying that very sentence, with his disdain, but instead of using tailor, he had used cowboy. You're far from common, she said. I need some tea. Pardon me. You're far from common, she said, and another simple truth was there that despite what her father had always said, and if you really love her, nothing else matters. Oh, I love her. Then he came closer. You're so wise, he murmured. I'm so proud of you. Why did that mean so much to her, that this man was proud of her, even if it was for something most people knew all their lives? Thank you. He tapped her chin. This is quite remarkable. So you and mother, you two, Yes, we two, he smiled there again. Now there's one more thing we wish to tell you, but Grace needs to be here for this. Grace, it's time. She turned to look at him, and then her mother was at the side. Boy, nothing was the same anymore. This woman facing her looked like a teenager, so happily and relieved that she could look at Carl and glance with her, and she ached for what they had, what she would never have now. Well, what else is there? She asked. Carl and Grace looked at each other, and then at Grace softly. Candace, darling, you better sit down for this. This is page 241. Grace and Carl left an hour later, and Candace wondered if the world had gone mad. She phoned Whitney and Dylan, leaving a message for the two of them to call her as soon as they could. She left the house out to the back terrace over the lawn. She hugged her arms around herself, as if she had to go back to the house and call Mark, but she couldn't make herself move. She had so much to absorb, so much to adjust to. She wondered if she'd ever be able to find her balance again. Page 242. She knew she wasn't alone at that moment, but it wasn't her name. She was hallucinating this time. She knew she had to be at the sound of the low, roughly whispered, "Darlin'." She closed her eyes. The imaging in her mind was driving her slightly crazy. She couldn't have heard what she thought she heard, and she believed that it was until that time again, until it came closer to her. "Darlin'." She closed her eyes and slowly turned around, and J.T. was there. Only in books, kids. I'm telling you, to find a stand-up man like this is a once-in-a-lifetime thing. Very rare. And I'm going to tell you how it goes. The morning sun showed, and the man she loved was standing there totally and completely with all of her heart. He was just a few feet from her, a white silk shirt open at the front to mold his broad shoulders, those jeans and his boots pressing into the sand. That Stetson shadowed his eyes from the sun, but nothing to lessen the impact of his gaze on her. This couldn't be happening. She backed up, ready to run away from this madness, but he stopped her. The maid said she saw you come down here. A pain so wrenching that she could barely breathe gripped her middle, and she didn't have the coronavirus. Sorry, I had to put that in there. He couldn't be here. He couldn't expect her to talk so calmly as if nothing had happened. Then she knew that he'd come back, and the pain grew. You have papers for me? This is page 243. He shook his head. Not yet. What are you doing here? He took another step towards her. She had to force herself not to run. I came after you. Now listen to this part, okay? He came after her. Oh. What? She whispered. You said the last time that I never came after you. He moved even closer. This time, I came after you. Why? She barely got that single word around, the tightness in her throat. He exhaled roughly, then still came closer. Obviously not doing the social distancing. Sorry, I had to do that. Don't run, he said softly. Listen to me. She couldn't run to save her life, which was just about what she was thinking and trying to do right then. Save her life. With him so close, she was within a heartbeat of losing whatever control she had managed to find. I thought you were in London. or with Voya, or getting the annulment papers drawn up. I was on my way to London, and I almost got on the Concorde in New York, but I couldn't. I realized that 8 years ago I left. I didn't go after you. And it's been 8 long years of emptiness. He narrowed as if minimizing a pain in some sort. I couldn't do that again. I couldn't make that mistake. He laughed, a rough, humorous sound, and echoed slightly off the bluffs. God, I couldn't live another day without you, much less another 8 years. Page 244. She started to shake, and she had to hug her arms around her middle to try to keep her from falling apart. I don't. She touched her tongue to the cold lips. I don't understand. He was closer, so close that she felt the heat of his breath brush her face as he exhaled before saying, "Understand this, Candace Montgomery. I know that you're planning on marrying Mark, that you regret what we've had. But I'm here to tell you that I'm not giving up, and I won't until I know there's no hope for us." Oh, where are these men in modern times? Anyway, she couldn't believe what she was hearing him say, or what she thought he was trying to say. No hope? He shook his head. They say that hope dies hard. Well, mine's going to die a long, slow, agonizing death. Why? He looked right at her, and then he touched her as his hands were touching on her shoulder, but the space was still separated between them. Because, darling, I love you. Ah! She truly knew now that she was truly mad. You love me? I know it might be too late, but I couldn't let it go. I got on a plane to get back here, and I'm telling you right now, I love you. I'll take you any way I can have you. No conditions, no ultimatums, any way at all. That smile was there, but it looked uneasy. A man who had built an empire, a man who never lost, looked unsure of himself. Just tell me I'm in the running, at least. Candace reached out and touched J.T. on the jaw. She felt that prickle of his new beard that was there and ran a finger down to the hollow throat. His pulse was racing, and yes, he was afraid, and yes, she knew the truth right then and there. Ah! Page 245. She moved closer to him, lifting her face, and a smile came from deep within her soul. Cowboy, you're not only in the running, you're the only runner. The next thing she knew, she was in his arms, and his lips found hers, a kiss like any other kiss they'd ever shared. He loved her. She held on to him, barely believing it, yet her whole soul knew it was true. She kept her arms around his neck, but moved back a little so she could look right into his eyes. J.T. Watson, I love you. He startled her when he threw back his head and yelled yes to the skies as he was spinning around and around in his arms. Then he stopped to give her a quick, fierce kiss before he drew back. My wife, he said softly. Forever, she whispered. Forever, he repeated. And that starts now. He looked down at the round beach and back down at her. I want you, and I want you now. This house is ours, she said, aching to be with him. What about your mother? She's not here, she said, unable to believe what she'd almost forgotten about her mother and Carl. You won't believe this, she said, never letting go of him as she headed toward the steps to the house. But my mother and Carl, well, she stopped and turned to face him from the bottom stair, bringing him to her to his eye level. Mother and Carl are together. Together where? No, I mean they're really together, J.T. They're in love. He looked at her, shocked in a moment, and then grinned as an expression that melted her heart. Well, I'll be damned. That was what he was talking about. Who talking about what? Carl, we commiserated about women trouble. Your mother was obviously his trouble. His smile slipped just a bit. Maybe she'll understand about us now. Your father never would have. But she got closer, circling his neck with her arms, bringing her face to within inches of his. J.T., there's only one more thing you should know about me. My father likes you a lot. He frowned at her. Darling, you're crazy. No, confused and shocked and very, very much in love with my husband, but I'm not crazy. She kissed him lightly, skimming her lips over his, and then drawing back. I just found out something about Carl and my mother. They should have just told me before just now told me before they left. This is on page 246. JT started to look bothered, and she didn't want to smooth the traces off his face. Darling, just tell me so we can go up to the house and I can show you just how much I love you. She shivered slightly with anticipation, but she had to tell him one last thing. She didn't know how to say it, so she simply just told him. Carl's my father. He looked shocked, and nothing compared to that shock that she had been an hour ago, but it seemed right somehow, some way. It was easy to say. My mother and he, they were in love a long, long time ago when my father, John, was having a terrible problem. Carl was there, and they fell in love, and she got pregnant. She did what she had to do. She stayed with John for all practical purposes, and I was his daughter. Carl wanted her to go with him then, but she couldn't. She was terrified that John would take Dylan, and she'd never see her son again, so she stayed, and she became the perfect wife. And so sad. She swallowed. John Montgomery was really good to me, despite everything. He loved me, but all the time Carl was there, watching out for me and for my mother. You have no idea how he watched out for you, JT whispered. She didn't understand, but she knew that there was a lifetime of things to figure out. He's been here all my life. He wanted Whitney raised here with her parents died, and that meant that he could be here for me. Oh, darling, that's quite a man to stay and watch from a distance. She could feel tears now, but she didn't fight them. He couldn't bear to be so far from my mother, even then, if he couldn't leave her. She's always been his one and only true love, and now they're going to be together after all these years. JT brushed her tears. After all these years, he echoed. I know how they feel. He framed her face with his hands. I knew I liked that man. How could I not like him when he's the father of my one and only love, my wife? Page 247, and no, you're not going to get to know what happened in the epilogue. You have to read this book and be a hopeless romantic heart like I was to get so lost in this book that you page turned very quickly. You wanted to know what was going to happen next. You wanted to know if love could really conquer all, and you wanted to see if all could be forgiven. And it was. If only in a book. If only a hopeless romantic like me could live in this book. If only I could be Candace. If only, if only, if only. Well, some of us bookworms never get that real life, happy story life ending. We deserve it. God knows. We've been through hell and back. But it is what it is. If it's meant to be, it will be. That's my 2020 saying. Don't fight so hard. Don't look so hard. If it's meant to happen to you, it'll find you. And it'll fight for you just like JT fought for you in this book. You know, as there's so many good points that Carl said in that book to JT. So many times you wish and you hope that those words fall on the right ears. And if maybe those right ears need to replay this video and hear those words over and over again. Anyway, the book gets a 40. Check the book out. You won't regret it. I'm losing my voice. Love you all. And I have started my coloring again. This says, you are my sunshine. I don't know. I just liked the sun and I thought it was bright and spirited for spring. That's what got me started on it. And after all, I needed something to keep my hands busy during the day. It is what it is. Best wishes. Wash those hands. God bless.